Okay. Well, this is a very interesting seminar, and I'm very pleased to be taking part in it. And it's interesting because its focus on archaeology and ritual is one with which I've been working for some time. And I'm going to focus today on the excavations I've been conducting on the island of Keros, in the Cycladic islands of Greece. But the excavation has led me to see more clearly, or at any rate think I see more clearly, some rather fundamental differences in the development of ritual behaviors and the emergence of religion. So I want to be very clear on a number of definitions, and I think obviously ritual is the focus of the seminar, and ritual is not easy to define in itself, but there are some features of ritual which are clear enough, I think, and ritual is usually performance of some kind. It may be individual performance, it may be group performance, but it's performance, and it has a number of significant features. First of all, performance clearly involves action, and that is why ritual is archaeologically discernible, because obviously it is only when actions take place that they can be recorded in the archaeological record. So it involves performative actions. Ritual seems always to be time structured. It is rituals in a sequence, and it's rituals in a repeated sequence. And it has a micro-time structure in the sense that the rituals are well defined in a short sequence of minutes or hours or days, but rituals are repetitive in a longer time sequence. Rituals may happen daily or annually or through other time periods, but when we're talking of serious rituals, they're not something that just happen once. They happen on a number of repeated occasions. So they're internally time structured on a micro scale, but they're also time structured on a much grander scale. Thirdly, rituals are often place specific. Some rituals, not all but some, take place at a particular location, and that particular location may be particularly well determined. Rituals involve performers. They have to, if it's ritual performance, if it's performative action, but they often involve observers. But the observers in the ritual are often, in a broader sense, participants in the ritual. If we were talking of a ritual in a church, for example, a Christian church, then you may have the priests who are undertaking the ritual actions, but the congregation are members and are participants, in a sense, in the performance. Rituals are affirmative, and that's a very vague word, but I'm going to go on in this lecture to make a distinction between ritual and religion, or rather, all religion involves ritual, but not all ritual involves religion, and that's a very important distinction. And so rituals are usually affirming something. They are reinforcing and reaffirming something. And that's the interesting thing about rituals. You can have secular rituals that are nothing to do with religion and nothing to do with religious beliefs. For instance, at Buckingham Palace, we have daily the changing of the guard. And the changing of the guard is undoubtedly a ritual. It is time structured in the micro scale, and it happens daily, so it's time structured in the broader scale. And it is performative, and it follows all these features which I've indicated are indicative of ritual, involving performers and participants and so on. It is affirmative. But affirmative of what? And that is the wonderful thing about ritual, which I think hasn't been sufficiently appreciated. Often we speak of ritual and religion as if they're the same thing. But what I'm beginning to look at, and I'll explain to you why in a moment, is that religion emerges from ritual. And when we're tracing back the origins of some religious structure, for instance, if we're tracing back the origins of Indo-European religion, which is no easy thing to do, it's easy to project that into the distant past. But it's not clear that there was, not clear to me, that there was an Indo-European religion in the distant past. There were rituals, no doubt, and out of those rituals, in different places and at different times, what we might describe as religions emerged. So it's actually interesting, and I would like to leave it for you as a question to think about, or we can discuss it shortly. What are rituals affirmative of? Well, of course, they're affirmative of different things. So what is a particular ritual affirmative of? Well, religious rituals are no doubt affirmative of the beliefs of the religion in question. But the point I'm making is that rituals go far beyond religion and far before religion, and that is why the question is such an interesting one. I should, before I go on, clarify what I mean by religion. So this is the second important topic. Religion involves worship. I'm trying to make a definition that would be a general definition, but I think it's true of all religions that they involve worship. What does that mean? Well, worship means paying respect to a divinity. And this is the point. Of course, we can use religion very broadly, but the way I think about religion and the way I'm using it today is that a religion is a belief system involving worship of a transcendent deity. So it's essential that if it's going to be a religion, that there should be a transcendent deity, a supernatural deity. And that is the feature of religions. The worship will normally involve submission and supplication. It involves submission because the deity is so powerful that a mere mortal can do nothing than offer submission and worship of the deity. And of course, the mere mortal can supplicate the deity to behave in certain ways. And much worship involves praying to the deity that certain beneficial consequences will follow. Religion also involves the numinous, and so there is always something mysterious about religion. A deity has a mystery surrounding his or hers or its personage, And so that's a very special feature of religious ritual, that it involves mystery and it involves the numinous. And being transcendent, there's always the liminal zone, the boundary zone between this world, which is our world as mortal beings, and the other world. And the other world is where the deity lives. The deity, being transcendent, can come freely into our world, but we as mere mortals cannot easily enter the other world where the deity is at home. Now, those are some very general thoughts, and when I've been talking about my excavations, I haven't usually gone into those abstractions, but I thought that since this is a seminar about archaeology and ritual, it was worth making some comments which should apply to all the lectures you've heard and are going to hear, unless I'm misguided in what I'm saying to you, in this series. And the ones you've already had, some of them dealing with worship of deities, those generalizations no doubt do apply. But others, when you've been talking about rituals, which are not necessarily devoted to deities, that might apply in the case of Easter Island, or would apply in the case of Papua New Guinea, then we're talking about rituals which may be directed to mysterious powers which we cannot yet dignify as religions. So let's be more specific now. Let's go to Keros, the Cycladic island of Keros, south of Naxos, and there you see the map of the Cycladic Islands. There is Keros, located south of Naxos. And I first visited Keros in 1963 when I was doing my doctoral research, and I'd been told by Christos Doumas, now Professor Christos Doumas, that there was a looted site on Keros. And here is the little island of Daskalio, which is just west of Keros, and there in the foreground is the area that I visited and was astonished to find great quantities of broken marble dishes and even a few marble figurines. There is the torso of a marble figurine, and there's the feet and there's the neck of marble figurines of a form which you may already know well. If you worked in the Cyclades, you certainly would know well. These are these very elegant folded arm figurines, as we call them, made of marble, which date from the 3rd millennium BC. They're sometimes associated by some archaeologists with some hypothetical Earth Mother, but I'm very skeptical about the general concept of an Earth Mother, which I think is just a leftover from the 17th and 18th centuries, and is a piece of mythical generalization, which I think is in general erroneous. This would have annoyed, or did annoy, my very good friend Maria Gimbutas, the late Maria Gimbutas, who was a great enthusiast for the Earth Mother, and I always had to speak more politely of the Earth Mother in Maria Gimbutas's presence than I do in your own, because I don't believe in the Earth Mother at all as a generalization. I think it's a complete misconception, and I'll perhaps say more about that in a moment. Well, I had the very good fortune to be part of an expedition to Keros again in 1987, and then in particular between 2006 and 2008 to excavate at the site with the permission of the Greek Archaeological Service and with financial assistance from the British School at Athens and the Institute for Aegean Prehistory and a number of other foundations, which I'll perhaps show you in a slide at the end. But what was very interesting was that we found two special deposits, one there which had been looted and one on the right-hand side which had not been looted, and they contained great quantities of deposited material. And the material was all broken. And it involved marble bowls like the one I showed you in the earlier slide, and broken pottery, and broken marble figurines, and here you some of these. We use the word figurine, we're talking about these small sculptures, not all so small as we'll see in a moment, and some of them, as you already know and has already seen, are very elegant. Those are these simple heads, which indeed so fascinated modernist sculptors in the early 20th century, like Picasso and Giacometti, and above all Brancusi, and had a large impact on the development of early 20th century art. But it was clear that what we were investigating were deliberate deposits. The material was probably brought in small bundles to Keros, and the bundles contained broken pottery, already broken, and broken marble figurines, and broken marble sculptures, and so on. And so that was a rather strange body of material to be finding. And just to the west, as you see, was the island of Dascalio, and that, on excavation, revealed itself to be the settlement where the people who were depositing these materials came to stay, probably temporarily. And we came to the conclusion that the permanent occupation of Dascalio Island, this small island, was probably quite a small number of people, just 20 or 30 people, but that it became much larger with perhaps a brief population of 200 or 300 people during the ceremonies which we inferred, the ceremonies of deposition, which we inferred took place at the other side. The island is called Dascalio, and the other side, on Keros Island, where the special deposits are, is called Kavos. So it was at Kavos, in the special deposit north, which was the looted one, and the special deposit south, which was the unlooted one. That's where the ceremonies, inferred ceremonies, took place. Now, on Dascalio, we were able to investigate a whole series of buildings, and we only excavated a relatively small part of the island. On our survey, we were able to show that most of the island had been built on, and so there was plenty of space to accommodate those 300 or 400 people when it was at its maximum. But the other side, on Kavos, must have been quite wild at times. This gives you an idea of the island of Keros. Keros is itself uninhabited today. It was, in earlier years, 50 years ago, it had a population of 5 or 6 people. It's not very suited to agriculture, but it is suited to the grazing of goats. Now, at these special deposits, and we're looking now at a slide from the special deposit south, there were really no structures to speak of. I'm going to claim in a moment that at Kavos we found a sanctuary. And then I'm going to try and explain what I mean by a sanctuary, and I'm going to go on to say that I don't think it was a sanctuary for the worship of these deities, which I don't think had yet come into existence, relating to what I said in my introduction, but it was a sanctuary for the deliberate deposition of ritually significant materials. And the broken objects, the ritually significant materials, were sometimes quite impressive. So here you see this rather rugged wall, and if I had a pointer I could indicate to you up here, just where the scale is. You see the centimetre scale. Just right of the centimetre scale is a fragment of the pelvis of a figure. And call it a figure is better than to call it a figurine, because it was quite large, and another piece of it was found nearby subsequently, and originally this sculpture was more than a metre tall. And there are one or two known, completely known, found in the 19th century, and this one that I'm going to show you now is from Amorgos. It's to be seen in the Archaeological Museum in Athens, and it's an impressive figure. As I say, this is about 1 metre 60 centimetres tall, so it is a formidably impressive sculpture. And one doesn't doubt that it was made with a serious purpose, and so that's something. Obviously, it's up to us to speculate about what was the purpose of such objects as this. And it is clear that these offerings, if you can call them that, these deposits that were being brought to Keros, were being brought from a whole range of Cycladic islands, and there are indications that some of the pottery was coming from further afield, although not from Crete. And so what are we to make of all of this? Well, that's up to you, and it's up to me, and it's up to the others of us that are interested. And how do we make sense of all of this? Well, I think it is clear from the circumstance that although we dug carefully and we sieved and so on, and I should point out that in the water sieving, we did careful water sieving of the materials, we found no human bones and no human teeth. So it's clear from that evidence that this was not a place of burial. So it was not a place for leaving human remains. Otherwise, you might have thought it was in fact, initially when people first found the looted special deposit north, they assumed that it was the remains of an early Cycladic cemetery which had been looted rather carelessly. But it turns out that even in the special deposit south that we dug quite carefully, the objects, the fragments, very rarely joined together. We had just a few joins, and there were not enough fragments to make complete sculptures, complete figurines, or complete marble bowls. And clearly there should have been, because we dug it very carefully, and it was undisturbed after deposition. From which we infer that the material was already broken when it was brought to Keros. So that's a rather strange carry-on, rather strange ritual. And I think we have to follow the suggestions of some other writers, Gail Hoffman and Elizabeth Hendricks, that these figures, which are sometimes found painted, they were carried in processions in the villages where they were used. Sometimes afterwards they were buried. You find some in the Cycladic cemeteries, but we on Keros now have found far more, although broken, than the total that has emerged from the Cycladic cemeteries. So they were probably carried in village processions, and it's interesting that some of them have clearly been painted more than once. And so that perhaps ties in with repeated ritual use in repeated processions when they were repainted the next year or whatever for the next year's procession. So that, I think, is how we have to imagine them being used originally. And then it must be that the time came for these sculptures and marble objects and ceramic objects to go out of use. And it was at that point, we must infer, that they were deliberately broken. And that's not altogether surprising. Quite often in rituals, when things have been used in rituals, they acquire a status, almost a holy status, so that if you're going to take them out of ritual use, it's not appropriate to give them an everyday use. And there are many examples of this, but for instance, in the Christian church, when the host, the wafer, which represents the body of Christ, is sanctified in the communion ceremony, if there's more host that survives than is required for the congregation, and the same is true for the sanctified wine, the wine that's been consecrated to symbolize the blood of Christ in the Christian communion ceremony, if there's more wine than is needed, it's actually inappropriate to pour the wine down the sink, and the priest has the obligation of drinking the remainder of the wine, which always seems a little odd, but indeed many things about the Christian communion ceremony are very special. And that's why I mention it, because that would be a case where sanctified things may not be returned to ordinary secular use, but must be treated in an appropriate manner. And it is the case that utensils used for the sacraments in the Christian church are still regarded as sanctified and are not taken into everyday use. Anyway, that's part of the explanation that we've put together for the rather curious ceremonies which took place around 2500 BC on the island of Keros. So I want to suggest now that it's possible to speak of what I will call the Confederacy of Keros, and by that I mean simply those communities which took part in the rituals at this central location of Keros. And Keros was clearly a ritual center because it was getting these deposits of broken materials from these participant communities, and I think we can call it a symbolic attractor. This particular place on Keros was understood to be the right place to take these broken materials, and there was clearly an obligation to take some of these broken materials to Keros, and yet some of the broken materials were not taken to Keros. So that's a little bizarre. And so in that sense, it was a place of pilgrimage. I'm going to suggest that there were no deities involved on Keros, although that's a matter of speculation. But if I'm right, then it's a pilgrimage without having a deity. But that is not particularly bizarre. We're all familiar with major pilgrimages which go to places like Lourdes or Santiago of Compostela, where the pilgrimages are in honor of deity and sometimes in honor of what you might almost regard as a subordinate deity. I don't think a Christian prelate would agree that a saint is a subordinate deity, but a saint is a holy person who is no longer alive but is still venerated, and in that sense could be regarded as a subordinate deity, but undoubtedly vastly subordinate to the Lord God of hosts, the Christian divinity. And this involved the ritual deposition of choice materials, and it involved, therefore, bringing together a community of what we may regard as peer polities, and that's simply the different villages who formed part of this wider community, which I'm calling the Confederacy of Keros. And the ritual materials involved a communal iconic image, which is that usually female figure with the folded arms. Now, She has been regarded as a paradigm example of the Great Earth Mother by Maria Gimbutas, but I've already told you, I hope not too disrespectfully, what I think about the Great Earth Mother, which is not very much. So I prefer to regard her as a kind of logo for the Confederacy of Keros. She symbolizes something, and it's a matter of discussion what she symbolizes. As far as I'm concerned, she symbolizes Keros and the Confederacy of Keros, but I don't load her significance any more heavily than that. Now, what I want to suggest to you is that this is a very widespread pattern of behavior, to have early centers of congregation. And it seems to me that if we're talking about the understanding of early ritual behaviors and going on to talk about early religious centers, and I will say a word about religious centers, and as I say, for me those involve a transcendent deity, which I don't think had yet come into existence by 2500 BC on Keros, we can see that there are a number of features. And so I'm going to show you some examples of what I regard as early centers of congregation. They will include Stonehenge, which I think Mike Parker-Pearson spoke about a couple of weeks ago, but they'll include Göbekli Tepe, as I'll show you some slides in a moment, which is the earliest center of congregation known in the world, and it's relevant to bring in other sites, as I'll suggest, Caral in coastal Peru, and sites all over the world. But the early centers of congregation I'm speaking of are sites where there is not yet any evidence for a central deity or central pantheon. And we can go on to talk about later times when indeed there are centers of congregation. Rome is a center of congregation, obviously, and the Hajj directs itself to a center of congregation, but those clearly are great centers of congregation centered upon omnipotent deities, indeed in those cases monotheistic deities. But we could equally be talking about Delos, and much closer to home if we are starting from Keros, first millennium BC Delos, which was of course the birthplace of Apollo and of Artemis, and those are two great deities who were celebrated by pilgrimages to Delos. So Delos was indeed a center of congregation, but it was a center of congregation of what was by then a highly structured theistic religion. But what I'm doing in this talk is to suggest that at an earlier period, and indeed an earlier stage, we have major centers of congregation, which are centers of congregation in the same manner as Keros, which are centers for ritual observances which are not yet centered upon a transcendent deity. So they are often feature monumentality. Stonehenge is a very good example, or ritual deposition, and Keros is a good example, or sometimes both. There is the lack of a conceptualized deity, as I've been saying. They are features, in general, of non-state societies, societies which are not yet organized at a state level. They involve pilgrimage. They involve often the formation of a community, because, as I imagine Mike Parker-Pearson will have told you, these days it's usual to think of Stonehenge as a center of congregation indeed, which gradually widened its influence, and in widening its influence, it built up its status as the center of an enlarged confederacy. These places are not just mausolea, they're not just dealing with human mortality, and they're quite often open-air places. So these are the ones which I'm going to mention today: Keros, Göbekli Tepe, Caral, Stonehenge, the Ring of Brodgar in Scotland, Karnak in Brittany, and Chaco Canyon, much more recently, in New Mexico. And I think it's fair to say that these early great centers are a feature of the first great transition of Homo sapiens. If we're speaking in evolutionary terms, as you know, our species Homo sapiens emerged something like 200,000 years ago in Africa, and around 60,000 years ago there was the out of Africa migration of the first sapient humans to leave Africa. There's details there we could discuss. It's more complicated than that. And it was after that time, or around that time, that humankind entered what I call the first tectonic phase. And tectonic, I'm thinking about the Greek word for carpenter, constructive phase. And a feature of this phase is the emergence of centers of congregation, of ritual practices and depositions, of monumentality, and of the increased use of images and icons. So let's go on at once to refer to Göbekli Tepe, which you see there in this arc. This is the hilly flanks of the Fertile Crescent. And there is this amazing site of Göbekli Tepe, which is one of the earliest centers in the world. It's about 10,000 BC. And there you see Göbekli Tepe. It turns out to be an artificial hill with the tree on top of it. And there you see the standing stones which Klaus Schmidt excavated when he began his excavations starting about 10,000 years, 10 years ago, not 10,000 years ago, 10 years ago, but he was finding stones erected 10,000 years ago. And it's interesting they were still standing. Those that you see there have not been re-erected, they were found standing. And they were found standing because soon after they were used, they were reburied, or buried I should say, with material between them up to the top. So they never had a chance to fall over, and they haven't fallen over since. And when Klaus Schmidt excavates them, that is what he finds. And some of them have sculptured reliefs. The stones were brought from nearby. He understands the site to be one that was still a hunter-gatherer site. He doesn't have any evidence of domesticated plant or animal remains, but it's the same time as pre-pottery Neolithic B Jericho, so farming in that general region had already begun to emerge. And so it's an amazing site with a whole series of these circles. It's the first great ritual site in the world, or it's the first monumental ritual site in the world. You may wish to discuss later when we talk about Paleolithic cave art or something, well, what's going on there? Well, it's very interesting things are going on in still earlier period from sort of 35,000 years ago onwards. But the painted caves were probably not, or most of them were not ritual centers. Most of them were not very much frequented. And we could discuss those figurines, the so-called Venus figurines, which you find in Slovakia and further east. They may well have been involved in rituals, but it's not altogether clear that we're speaking there of ritual centers. And we're certainly not speaking much about monumentality. But when you get to Göbekli Tepe, suddenly you have this great monumental center, which I'm sure we must regard as a center of congregation, as in the manner I described. So let's move on to Caral in coastal Peru. Now, it may seem rather superficial to rush from one part of the world to another in this way, and perhaps it is superficial, but I'm making the claim that the site of Caral, like the site of Göbekli Tepe, would fall within the definition of a centre of congregation, as I just listed some of the key points. And it does fulfill those key points. It dates from around 3000 BC, which is very early in the Peruvian sequence. It wouldn't be early in Anatolia, but it's early in the Peruvian sequence. It's again just the time that food production was beginning. But much of the population on the coast, and Caral is only some 20 miles from the coast, much of the population was living on the abundant marine resources, mainly fish, that could be got from there, but from the sea. But the monuments at Caral are really quite amazing, and they've led the excavator, Ruth Shadi Solis, to speak of a civilization. But I don't think civilization is the right word. If you're talking about a hierarchical society, maybe a state society, you don't see the indications of high personal ranking at Caral that you do in the early Sumerian or Egyptian societies that we regard as state societies. But here are some of the great monuments, which are really quite numerous at this time in coastal Peru. And sometimes when we're talking about the origins of statehood and so on, we don't sufficiently integrate the South American experience into our own. Although I know you have indeed been doing so in this seminar. You had, you're having moche or such things, which the Moche Society, I understand to be a state society, so I would put it in the category of society where religion fully formulated has emerged, which I'll mention in a moment. But Caral is, for our purposes, rather more interesting. It's earlier, and it doesn't have any accompanying iconography that would lead you to think about deities. Though, of course, there may have been such an iconography in textiles and so on, which are not preserved. So there is the so-called pyramid, and here is a plaza. And this clearly was a center of congregation, and it's no doubt the case that great numbers of people congregated in this plaza. And we do find some artifacts. These are the flutes which have been found at Caral, and so some artifacts are found, but it's still an ceramic site. Pottery is not yet made in Peru at that time, and it's largely a non-food producing site. There are just incipient food production. Well, I'm going to move on in this rather superficial survey to remind you, if you need reminding, of the megaliths of northwestern Europe, which emerge with the beginning of the farming, with the beginning of the Neolithic way of life in northwestern Europe, and those shaded areas there are where they're mainly found. And you're already familiar with Stonehenge. Mike Parker Pearson has been telling you about that. But I think nobody would doubt that Stonehenge is a monument and that it is a place of congregation. Also, it is the case that there is really no specific iconography associated with Stonehenge. And we know a lot about it, as he will have said, but it's well enough described, I think, as being a place of congregation, a place of pilgrimage, in the manner that I've already spoken of. And with it, in a sense, not so far away, is Silbury Hill, which is another formidable monument. And then at the north of Scotland, we have the Orkney Islands, which are the Neolithic of the Orkney Islands is broadly contemporary with the Neolithic of southern Britain. And here is one of the great monuments of the Orkney Islands, where I've had the privilege of excavating. This is the Ring of Brodgar. And Mike Parker Pearson will probably have told you about the grooved ware, which is a particular kind of pottery, decorated pottery, which seems to be found first in the Orkney Islands and is indeed found as far south as Stonehenge. So there are some suggestions that some people in the Orkney Islands may have heard of Stonehenge, and perhaps some people at Stonehenge may have heard of the Ring of Brodgar. And there are remarkable excavations going on now at the Ness of Brodgar, near the Ring of Brodgar, where large monumental buildings have been discovered. And this is all quite recent news. But let's go on now just to quote another example, which is in Brittany, and I'm sure you're familiar with the so-called alignments of Brittany, which are roughly the same period as we are speaking of, and which are undoubtedly monumental, and their function has never really been very well explained in any detail, but they are monumental. They are no doubt places of pilgrimage, and they involve clearly a great seriousness of purpose. They involve huge efforts of labour, and they must, in a general sense, be analogous to Stonehenge or to Corral or to Göbekli Tepe, in the very general sense that they are monumental, constructed with great investment of work hours, and were visited periodically, and each was the centre of a confederacy, if you like that term, and I'm not really claiming it to mean anything more than a central place which was visited regularly by people from more peripheral places to it. And that's all I mean when I speak of the Confederacy of Keros, and that's what in this case one might mean if we speak of the Confederacy of Karnak. So there are indeed some of these stones. As you know, you can visit them today, and deeply impressive they are. And with them are associated, though not immediately associated, quite high prestige items. This is one of those beautiful axes of jadeite. The jade comes from the Alps, which are quite frequently found near Karnak, near Brittany, and indeed sometimes even in Scotland, where they sometimes occur not so far from some of those sites. Now, what I want to do is to contrast these early centres of congregation, which clearly are the focus of one kind of ritual, which is the focus of my talk today, with the emergence of deities, which we can call the second sapient transition, the second transition of Homo sapiens, which involves social hierarchies, if you like, state societies, and formalized religion. And I've restricted my use of the word religion in this talk to formalized religion of this kind. And so we see the emergence of deities and of shrines dedicated to deities. So the features we're talking about are a constructed space. If we're talking about a shrine or a temple, it will be a constructed space which will have an attention-focusing feature. It will be in a liminal zone. That's, I think, not easy to observe archaeologically, but it is a position where the daily, the quotidian, and the transcendental meet. It will have the presence of the transcendent and a symbolic focus. It will involve participation and offering. It will involve paraphernalia and iconography. Now, if you are looking skeptically, critically at the distinction I'm drawing between the earlier centers of congregation and these shrines of transcendent deities, you might well ask, well, what's so different? A center of congregation, as defined earlier, or these places where deities and shrines are worshipped? Well, in the deities and shrines, you definitely hope to find some indication of the deity. Of course, it doesn't always happen that way. If you're a follower of the Jewish faith, you will not see representations of the deity, of the Hebrew deity, in a synagogue. But you will see representations of the deity in the churches of many faiths. The Islamic faith is like the Jewish faith, tends to be an-iconographic. It tends to avoid images, depictions of the deity. But many faiths do have such depictions, and certainly even an-iconic faiths do have attention-focusing devices, particular place where the deity is particularly felt to be present, and so it's a matter for discussion how, if we're just a digging up kind of archaeologist and we find a monumental center, is it a center of congregation of the first kind, or is it a religious center of the second kind? That's a matter for discussion. Now, there are many examples, clearly, in the archaeological record for the emergence of deities and shrines, and at a world level, obviously we might go to Egypt and look at the first temples of Egypt, which more or less coincide with the first pharaohs of pharaonic Egypt. Or we might go to Sumer and look at the first temples, which seem there actually to precede the first dynasties of Sumer. Or we might go, and I will take you there in a moment, to Chavin-Tehuantla in Peru, where you certainly have the rather disconcerting experience of coming face to face with the deity. But I'll start with the Aegean, because my focus today is mainly on the Aegean, and it is at Akrotiri on Thera, in the wonderfully preserved remains buried by the eruption of Thera, that you do actually have the opportunity of seeing iconography which makes you accept that, yes, we are dealing here with the deity. And I excavated myself at Philokopi in Milos, where I think you can say something of the same, the Tenerife in comparison with Crete. Then you have the other shrines in CReA and Mycenae and Tiryns and so on, which you can speak of. So here is the plan of the excavations at Akrotiri, initiated by Marinatos. But here is this wonderful restored fresco, which is quite something. And there you see this very large lady, and I think she's clearly a divine person. Now, what makes me feel able to identify her as a goddess? Of course, a lot of other people have done so before me, but it's because she's flanked by, she has an animal, a familiar, if you like, as a winged griffin. Now, you and I don't have winged griffins attending upon us. Winged griffins are for deities. Deities, actually very difficult to distinguish. If you met a deity in the street, you're not always easy to be sure if this person has transcendental powers, but if they're accompanied by a winged griffin, you know they are somebody. And she is also, she is receiving offerings from a monkey, which is another indication, and receiving offerings also from a lady offering her crocuses. Well, the point here is that I think it's difficult to doubt that in this fresco at Zesti 3, we have a representation of a goddess figure. And that is the point I'm making. In my own excavations at Philokopi in Milos, and at the bottom there on the green area was the building or buildings we excavated, which we came to call the shrine, and there is the plan, and there is the head, small head of gold, sheet gold, which may originally have been wrapped around one of these bronze figures, the so-called smiting god. and we found indications of music. This tortoise shell had been pierced and was no doubt a sound box for a lyre or something of that kind. And we found numerous terracotta figures and figurines and this beautiful seal stone. But in particular, this figure, so-called Lady of Philocope, which might represent a goddess or might represent somebody paying respects to a goddess. There you see her again, and there is the reconstruction of the shrine by our architect Alec Dakin. And in writing about it, I tried to discuss the various features which might make it appropriate to describe this as a shrine dedicated to a deity. And in order to try and make that case, I had to make comparisons with Minoan Crete. And in Minoan Crete, you have the so-called Minoan goddess with upraised arms, and in particular you have the Agia Triada sarcophagus, where you see people bringing what one may regard as offerings, including this trussed ox, which they are presenting at a shrine with the horns of consecration. Now, if you're very skeptical, you can say, well, really, does this have to involve a deity? And I think in the case of Minoan Crete, the evidence is rich enough to suggest that you do. And I would like to make the same claim for the shrine at Philocope, a claim I made many years ago, and a claim which can be echoed also for the site of Agerini in Kea, where you have these very large figures standing on the table. They would be so high, terracotta figures, which are generally regarded as attendants of the deity there. The case is, of course, much easier to make when you go on to Delos in the 8th and 7th centuries BC, and then the 6th century you have the wonderful archaic lions, and so there you, and of course you have sculptures of Apollo and so on. You do see Apollo and sometimes Artemis on Delos. So what I've done, and I'm really just going to sum up now, and I hope we can have some discussion. What I've done is to try and distinguish a class of monuments which we may call centers of congregation, which came into existence long before the first temples and the first shrines dedicated to the first proper deities, the first transcendent deities. And so I think that's an important distinction to make, and I've already tried to indicate the diagnostic features of these centers of congregation. So just to sum up again, I've got promised to show you, indeed put you in the face of the most terrifying deity I've ever met, which is the Lanson at Chavin Tehuanta. So this takes you back. I was summing up too early. I don't want to deprive you of, this is coastal Peru and there is Caral, and inland, if you go over those mountains, there is Chavin Tehuanta, which dates from around 1000 BC. And there is the excavations as been conducted recently. And there is a plan of the site, and it uses the same kind of platforms and so on that were introduced in Peru 2,000 years earlier at coastal sites like Caral that we were speaking of. But Chavin is the center of a cult. It's not entirely clear that it was part of a state society, but state societies were getting going in Peru by this time. The political status of Chavin itself is not entirely clear, but here is the facade of one of the one of the buildings, and I should go back to mention that it's underground through some subterranean galleries that you get, and here is one of these subterranean galleries, that you suddenly find yourself coming into the presence of the lanson, which is a sculptured stone, and it's seen a little more clearly in the next slide. And there it is, and it's still in position, and it has an elaborate iconography. There are all kinds of things going on there. But I think when you see it, I tell you, I was easily persuaded that it is a representation of a supreme deity. It's really the most arresting divine image which I've ever seen, and I use it as an example of a religious image of the second category, to be compared, if you like, with the lady from Zesty 3 with the winged griffin. But it's a lot more scary than the lady with the winged griffin. So here now, beginning to sum up, before religion, we have mobilization in egalitarian societies. We have issues of subsistence and population density. We have centers of congregation, and we have pilgrimages without deities, as I've indicated. And with the emergence of state societies, we have pronounced social hierarchy and the first deities and the first formalized religion. There are issues of mobilization to take into account here. Competition may be an important factor. And subsistence and population density are clearly key features if we're trying to understand why did these societies with their centers of congregation emerge when they did. I think the answer has to come in terms of considering population density and considering subsistence, and from that one gets some idea of what the relative factors were. And so to go back to our centers of congregation, we have Stonehenge, as I already indicated to you, which I think remains one of the most remarkable, particularly because of that alignment on the midsummer sunrise or midwinter sunset. And Göbekli, which is now clearly the earliest, and then we've spoken of Caral, and then I finish, as I began, with the icon of the Confederacy of Keros and with the island of Keros itself. So I look forward to your comments. Thank you very much.